Welcome back, dear friends. Before we begin, let me know where in the world you are watching from tonight, and please do not forget to subscribe and like to support the channel. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let the warm rhythms of a forgotten era carry you gently into the night. There is a warm breeze drifting across the Malecon tonight. It is December 31st, 1958, and somewhere high above Havana, in a penthouse suite overlooking the Caribbean Sea, a short man with cold eyes is watching his empire crumble. His name is Meyer Lansky, and for nearly a decade, he has been the architect of the most audacious criminal enterprise the Western Hemisphere has ever seen. Down below, in the glittering casinos and smoky nightclubs, tourists from Miami and New York are drinking rum cocktails and placing bets on roulette wheels, blissfully unaware that within hours, everything they see around them will be gone. Revolutionaries are marching toward the city. A dictator is preparing to flee. And an entire way of life, built on glamour and corruption, on music and violence, on dreams and exploitation, is about to vanish like smoke from a Cuban cigar. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how this tropical paradise became the playground of American gangsters, how it danced on the edge of revolution while champagne corks popped in marble lobbies, we need to go back to a time when Havana was just beginning to discover what it might become. Back to when the deals were being made in hotel rooms and the foundations of a criminal empire were being laid, one handshake at a time. This is the story they do not tell you in the history books. The story of glamour hiding desperation, of music drowning out suffering, of a city that burned so brightly it could not help but consume itself. Close your eyes and let me take you there. The Havana of the early 1950s was a city of contradictions, a place where Spanish colonial architecture stood beside Art Deco towers, where horse-drawn carts shared cobblestone streets with gleaming American automobiles. If you had walked along the Malecon in those days, that famous seawall stretching for miles along the waterfront, you would have seen lovers holding hands as the sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. You would have smelled salt air mixing with the smoke of cigars being rolled in nearby factories. You would have heard the distant sound of a mambo band warming up for the evening, the rhythm already starting to pulse through the humid air. The city itself was a living museum of colonial history. The old quarter, known as Habana Vieja, still retained the narrow streets and crumbling palaces that the Spanish had built centuries before. Cathedral Plaza held the remains of Christopher Columbus, or so they claimed, and the ancient fortress of Morro Castle guarded the entrance to the harbor, as it had since the days when pirates prowled the Caribbean. But beyond the old walls, modern Havana was rising. The Vedado district, with its tree-lined streets and elegant mansions, was home to the Cuban elite. Further out, new suburbs were spreading into the countryside, and construction cranes dotted the skyline along the waterfront. Cuba in those years was not poor by Latin American standards. In fact, the island ranked among the wealthiest nations in the region. Havana boasted more television sets per capita than most of its neighbors, more automobiles, more telephones. The city had a thriving middle class, doctors and lawyers and businessmen who lived in elegant homes in the Vedado district, who sent their children to good schools and dreamed of prosperity. The University of Havana produced intellectuals and artists who debated politics in cafes and published poetry in little magazines. There was culture here, sophistication, a sense that Cuba was destined for something great. The economy ran on sugar, as it had for centuries. Vast plantations covered the countryside, and during harvest season the roads were clogged with trucks carrying cane to the mills. American companies owned about 40% of the sugar land, and the United States was the primary market for Cuban exports. This relationship had its advantages and its costs. Cuba had guaranteed access to the American market, which meant stable prices and reliable demand, but it also meant that the island's economy was utterly dependent on a single crop and a single trading partner, vulnerable to forces beyond its control. But there was another Havana too. Walk a few blocks from the grand hotels and you would find narrow streets where families crowded into single rooms, where children went barefoot and meals were uncertain. The tenements of old Havana housed thousands of families in conditions that would have shocked the tourists drinking daiquiris at the Hotel Nacional. There was no running water in many buildings, no indoor plumbing, no electricity after dark. Women washed clothes in communal tubs and hung them from balconies that threatened to collapse. Children played in streets that had not been cleaned in years. Drive out into the countryside, and you would discover a different world entirely. The sugarcane workers, the macheteros, lived lives of grinding poverty. They worked 4 months of the year during the harvest, swinging their machetes under a brutal sun from dawn until dusk, and spent the other 8 months in desperate unemployment. Their bohios, the small wooden huts they called home, had dirt floors and thatched roofs. Many had no access to schools, no access to doctors, no way to improve their situation. A 1956 study found that 17% of the Cuban labor force was unemployed, with another 13% classified as underemployed. During the dead season, nearly 500,000 people had no work at all. In 1953, the average Cuban family earned just $6 a week. A third of the population had no running water. Illiteracy was common in the rural areas, and healthcare was a luxury most could not afford. Clusters of graveyards dotted the highway along the foothills of the Sierra Maestra Mountains, marking the spots where people had died waiting for transportation to distant hospitals. This was the great paradox of pre-revolutionary Cuba. The statistics painted a picture of a nation on the rise, but the averages hid dramatic inequalities. Havana gleamed while the provinces suffered. The wealthy danced in nightclubs while sugar workers went hungry during the dead season, that long stretch between harvests when there was no work and no money, and nothing to do but wait and hope. The island was prosperous enough to attract tourists and investors, poor enough to breed resentment and rage. The Americans had been involved in Cuba for half a century by then. After helping to liberate the island from Spain in 1898, the United States had maintained a complicated relationship with its Caribbean neighbor. American troops had occupied Cuba for years after independence, and the Platt Amendment had given Washington the right to intervene in Cuban affairs whenever it deemed necessary. American companies owned vast sugar plantations, controlled the utilities, dominated the mining industry. American banks handled much of the island's finances. By the late 1950s, about 75% of Cuban imports came from the United States, while some 65% of Cuban exports found their way to American markets. American tourists had been coming to Havana since the 1920s, drawn by the proximity, the weather, the nightlife, and something else too. During Prohibition, when alcohol was banned in the United States, thirsty Americans discovered that Cuba was just a short boat ride away, and the rum flowed freely there. Havana became a place where you could do things that were forbidden back home, where you could drink and gamble and forget your troubles for a while. The bars of Havana, from the elegant La Floridita where Hemingway sipped his daiquiris to the rowdy waterfront dives where sailors spent their wages, became famous throughout the Americas. This tradition of escape, of indulgence, of leaving your inhibitions at the dock, would only grow stronger in the decades to come. By the early 1950s, more than 200,000 American tourists were visiting Cuba each year. For about $50, you could buy a package that included round-trip airfare from Miami, a hotel room, meals, and entertainment. The casinos were legal, and the drinks were cheap, and the music was like nothing you had ever heard before. Magazine advertisements promised paradise, and for a weekend at least, that promise seemed to come true. A 1956 issue of Cabaret Quarterly, a tourism magazine of the era, described Havana as a mistress of pleasure, the lush and opulent goddess of delights. The description was apt. This was a city that existed to satisfy desires, a place where the normal rules of American life did not apply. What happened in Havana, as they would say later about another city, stayed in Havana, but paradise, as it turned out, was for sale. And the men who would buy it were not the kind of men you would want to meet in a dark alley. To understand how the American mob came to own Havana, we need to talk about a man named Fulgencio Batista. His story is one of ambition and betrayal, of a poor, mixed-race boy from the countryside who rose to become the most powerful man in Cuba, only to sell his country's soul for a share of the profits from illegal gambling. Batista was born in 1901 in the town of Barnes, in the eastern province of Oriente. His family was poor, his father a sugarcane worker who struggled to provide for his children. The young Fulgencio received little formal education and spent his early years working various jobs, from sugarcane fields to railroad yards. He was handsome in a rough way, intelligent despite his lack of schooling, and ambitious beyond anything his circumstances might have suggested. At 20, Batista joined the Cuban army, where he discovered his true calling. He had a gift for politics, for reading situations and manipulating people, and he rose quickly through the ranks. The opportunity he had been waiting for came in 1933, during a period of revolutionary upheaval that was sweeping Cuba. Batista led what became known as the Revolt of the Sergeants, a military uprising that overthrew the provisional government and left him in effective control of the country. For the next 7 years, Batista ruled Cuba through a series of puppet presidents, making and unmaking governments at will while maintaining his position as the power behind the throne. He was careful to cultivate support from all quarters, from the military officers who kept him in power to the American investors who needed stability to protect their interests. He was ruthless when necessary, but preferred bribery to violence, understanding that enemies could often be more useful as allies if the price was right. Then in 1940, something unexpected happened. Batista ran for president in an actual democratic election, and he won. He sponsored a progressive constitution that guaranteed civil liberties and workers' rights. He allowed the formation of political parties, including the Communist Party, and when his term ended in 1944, he did something remarkable for a Latin American strongman of that era. He stepped down peacefully and allowed his opponent, Ramon Grau San Martin, to take office. For the next 8 years, Cuba experimented with democracy. It was a messy democracy, plagued by corruption and political violence. Gangs affiliated with different political factions fought in the streets. Government ministers stole millions from the treasury. But for all its flaws, it was democracy, with competitive elections and peaceful transfers of power. Batista retired to Florida, living comfortably on the fortune he had accumulated during his years in power. He might have stayed there, fading into obscurity like so many other retired dictators, enjoying his money and his memories. But Batista was not the kind of man who could accept irrelevance. He missed the power, the attention, the feeling of being at the center of events. And as he watched from Miami, he saw Cuba descending into chaos. The democratic governments that followed him were incompetent and corrupt, unable to address the economic problems facing the country or control the violence in the streets. Batista convinced himself that Cuba needed him, that only he could restore order and progress. In March of 1952, with elections approaching and his prospects looking dim, Batista staged a coup. In the middle of the night, he returned to Cuba, gathered his loyal officers, and seized control of the government. The president he overthrew, Carlos Prio Socarrás, fled to the Mexican embassy without firing a shot. It was a bloodless takeover, swift and professional, and when the sun rose the next morning, Fulgencio Batista was once again the ruler of Cuba. The ease of the coup revealed something troubling about Cuban society. The democratic institutions that had been built over the previous decade were fragile, easily swept aside by a determined man with military backing. The political parties that should have opposed the takeover were too fractured and corrupt to organize any resistance. And the Cuban people, exhausted by years of gang violence and government scandals, seemed willing to give Batista a chance to restore order. They did not yet know what kind of order he had in mind. What most Cubans did not know was that Batista had made a deal before the coup, a deal that would shape the future of their country in ways they could not have imagined. The details of this arrangement were hammered out in a suite at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City, where Batista met with a man who would become his closest partner and benefactor. That man was Meyer Lansky. Lansky was already a legend in the American underworld by 1952. Born in what is now Belarus in 1902, he had immigrated to New York as a child and grown up on the mean streets of the Lower East Side. Small in stature but brilliant in mind, he had risen through the criminal ranks to become the financial genius of the American mob. He did not look like a gangster. He dressed conservatively, spoke softly, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of a successful businessman, which, in a sense, he was. Lansky had pioneered the concept of organized crime as a corporate enterprise with diversified investments, careful bookkeeping, and long-term strategic planning. His childhood friends had included some of the most notorious criminals of the 20th century. Lucky Luciano, who would restructure the American Mafia and rule it for decades, had grown up on the same streets. So had Bugsy Siegel, the volatile gangster who would later build the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas and pay for his mistakes with his life. These three had formed a partnership as teenagers, and that partnership had shaped the American underworld ever since. Lansky had first visited Cuba in the 1930s, and he had seen the island's potential immediately. It was a nation just 90 miles from the American coast, beyond the reach of American law enforcement, with a weak government that could be bought and a population that needed jobs. If a man could gain control of the casinos and hotels, if he could create a destination that rivaled anything in Nevada, the profits would be enormous. And unlike Las Vegas, where the FBI was always watching, in Cuba, a clever gangster could operate in the open, protected by a friendly dictator. The deal Lansky offered Batista was simple and profitable for both parties. In exchange for control of Cuba's gambling industry, Lansky and his associates would pay Batista handsomely. The dictator would receive a percentage of every casino's profits, direct payments to his Swiss bank accounts, and regular cash deliveries to his wife's personal bagman. Some estimates suggest that Lansky was paying Batista millions of dollars per year, an astonishing sum that made the Cuban president one of the wealthiest men in Latin America. In return, Batista would create a legal framework that made Cuba irresistible to mob investment, and he delivered on his end of the bargain with enthusiasm. In 1955, Batista enacted Hotel Law 2070, a piece of legislation that seemed innocuous on the surface, but was actually a blueprint for turning Havana into a gangster's paradise. The law offered extraordinary incentives to anyone willing to invest in Cuban tourism, build a hotel worth more than $1 million, and the government would match your investment dollar for dollar. Using funds from the State Development Bank, you would receive a tax exemption for 10 years. And most importantly, you would automatically receive a license to operate a casino. The law was an open invitation to the American mob, and they accepted with enthusiasm. Within months, the building cranes appeared on the Havana skyline. Mint cement trucks rumbled through the streets. Architects drew up plans for glittering towers that would rise along the Malecón and transform the city's waterfront. The transformation of Havana into the Las Vegas of the Caribbean had begun. Batista offered Lansky an official position, a salaried role as an unofficial gambling minister responsible for growing and regulating the casino industry. It was an extraordinary arrangement, a sovereign government hiring a known American criminal to manage an entire sector of its economy. But in the Cuba of the 1950s, such arrangements were not just possible, but normal. The line between legitimate business and organized crime had blurred beyond recognition. Import duties were waived on construction materials for new hotels, allowing investors to bring in equipment from the United States without paying taxes. This provision was routinely abused, with contractors importing far more than they needed and selling the surplus for hefty profits. Cuban companies with the right political connections grew rich on the overruns. Everyone who touched these projects seemed to come away with money in their pockets. The license fees for operating a casino were set at $250,000, a substantial sum but nothing compared to the potential profits. And there were rumors that beyond the official fees, additional payments were required under the table. Politicians at every level expected their share. The system was designed to extract maximum value from every transaction, with Batista and his inner circle sitting at the top of the pyramid. Meyer Lansky installed himself in Suite 829 of the Hotel Nacional, a magnificent Spanish-style resort overlooking the ocean that had been hosting dignitaries and celebrities since its opening in 1930. Winston Churchill had stayed there. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor had honeymooned there. Now it was the command post for an American gangster's Caribbean empire. From his windows, Lansky could look out over the sea and contemplate the fortune he was building on this beautiful, corrupt island. But Lansky had been dreaming of Cuba long before Batista's coup, and to understand the full scope of his ambition, We need to go back a few more years to a gathering that took place in that very same hotel during the Christmas season of 1946. They called it the Havana Conference, though officially it was just a group of businessmen enjoying a winter vacation in Cuba. The cover story was that they had come to see Frank Sinatra perform at the hotel's casino, and Sinatra was indeed there, flying in from Miami with his friends the Fischetti brothers, who happened to be cousins of the infamous Al Capone. The young singer, not yet the legend he would become, crooned for an audience of men in expensive suits who listened with the appreciation of connoisseurs. They should have appreciated him. Many of them had helped finance his early career, and Sinatra's connections to organized crime would follow him for the rest of his life. But the real business of the Havana Conference happened in private suites and quiet corners, away from the music and the champagne. The gathering had been organized by Lansky, and its purpose was nothing less than to reorganize the American underworld and plot its expansion into international territory. The guest list read like a who's who of organized crime. Charles Lucky Luciano, the architect of the modern American Mafia, had secretly traveled from Italy, where he lived in exile, slipping into Cuba on a false passport. Luciano had been deported from the United States after serving time for running a prostitution ring, but he remained the most respected figure in the American underworld, a man whose approval was necessary for any major decision. Frank Costello, known as the Prime Minister of the underworld for his political connections and smooth diplomacy, represented the Luciano crime family's interests in New York. Vito Genovese, scheming and ambitious, was already plotting to take over Luciano's organization. Santo Trafficante Jr. from Tampa represented the Florida interests, controlling gambling operations along the Gulf Coast. Albert Anastasia, the fearsome Lord High Executioner of Murder Incorporated, the mob's enforcement arm, attended as well. His presence was a reminder that behind all the business discussions lay the threat of violence. From Chicago came the Fischetti brothers and their associates, representing the remnants of Al Capone's organization. From Cleveland, Mo Dalitz and the Jewish gangsters who ran the gambling operations there and would later become major figures in Las Vegas. From New Orleans, Carlos Marcello, who would one day be suspected of involvement in the assassination of President Kennedy. From Buffalo, Stefano Magaddino. From New Jersey, Londy Zwillman and Doc Stacher. Each of these men brought an envelope stuffed with cash, a Christmas present for Luciano that totaled more than $200,000. The gesture was more than generosity. It was an acknowledgement that Luciano, despite his exile, remained the boss of bosses, the man whose approval was needed for any major decision affecting the syndicate's operations. The conference lasted for a week, and the men discussed matters of great importance to their organization. They debated what to do about Bugsy Siegel, who was hemorrhaging money on his Flamingo Hotel project in Las Vegas and was suspected of skimming from his partners. Lansky defended his old friend, begging the others for patience, but the verdict was already forming in their minds. Siegel had promised that the Flamingo would be ready by Christmas 1946, but it was nowhere near completion. He had originally estimated the cost at $1 million, but the actual expenses had ballooned to $6 million and were still climbing. Some of the bosses believed Siegel was stealing from them, siphoning construction funds into his own accounts. Others simply thought he was incompetent, a violent man who was in over his head trying to manage a complex business operation. Either way, patience was wearing thin. Lansky won a temporary reprieve for his friend, arguing that the Flamingo could still succeed if given more time, but the message was clear. Siegel needed to deliver, or there would be consequences. Within 6 months, Bugsy Siegel would be shot dead in his girlfriend's living room in Beverly Hills, killed by a rifle fired through the window while he sat reading the newspaper. No one was ever charged with the murder, but the timing made clear that it was a mob execution. The Flamingo eventually became profitable, but Siegel did not live to see it. The most important discussions at the Havana Conference concerned the future of Cuba itself. Lansky shared his vision with the assembled bosses. He painted a picture of an island transformed, a place where the mob could operate openly, protected by a cooperative government, beyond the reach of American law, They would build hotels and casinos that would make Las Vegas look provincial. They would create a destination that would attract the wealthy and the famous from around the world. And beneath the glittering surface, they would establish the infrastructure for an even more profitable enterprise. Cuba could serve as a way station for narcotics flowing from Europe and South America into the United States. Drugs could be stored there, processed there, shipped from there, all under the protection of Cuban officials who were eager to accept payments in exchange for looking the other way. The profits from gambling would be substantial, but the profits from drugs would be astronomical. It was an audacious dream, and it would take years to realize. Luciano was forced to leave Cuba within months of the conference, exposed by rivals and pressured by the American government. The United States threatened to cut off all pharmaceutical exports to Cuba unless Luciano was expelled, a threat the Cuban government could not ignore. Lucky Luciano returned to Italy and never saw Havana again, dying of a heart attack in 1962 at the Naples airport, but the seed had been planted. When Batista seized power in 1952, Lansky was ready to make his move. The vision he had outlined at the Hotel Nacional would finally become reality. Santo Traficante Jr. became Lansky's key partner in the Cuban operation. The Tampa boss had been moving into Havana since the mid-1940s, establishing connections and learning how the island worked. His father, Santo Traficante Sr., had built the Tampa family into one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the Southeast, with interests in gambling, bootlegging, and labor racketeering. The younger Traficante inherited this empire and expanded it dramatically. By the mid-1950s, Traficante was spending most of his time in Cuba, overseeing a portfolio of businesses that included the San Souci nightclub, one of Havana's most popular entertainment venues. He had interests in the Hotel Capri, which opened in 1957 with the actor George Raft serving as the public face of the operation. Raft, who had made his name playing gangsters in Hollywood movies, was the perfect frontman, lending an air of glamour and legitimacy to what was essentially a mob investment. Traficante was different from Lansky in important ways. Where Lansky was cautious and calculating, Traficante was more willing to get his hands dirty. He had a reputation for violence that Lansky lacked. But the two men complemented each other well. Lansky provided the strategic vision and the financial expertise, while Traficante handled the day-to-day operations and maintained relationships with Cuban officials and partners. The casinos themselves were designed to be irresistible. Lansky understood that the key to successful gambling operations was trust. Customers had to believe that the games were fair, that the house edge was the only advantage working against them. At his establishments, there were no loaded dice, no marked cards, no rigged roulette wheels. The dealers were professionals who dealt blackjack from a shoe rather than from their hands, eliminating any possibility of sleight-of-hand manipulation. Floor managers watched the action constantly, looking for any sign of cheating by customers or employees alike. The interior design of these casinos was meant to create an atmosphere of excitement and possibility. Crystal chandeliers hung from ornate ceilings. Thick carpets muffled footsteps and absorbed the sounds of victory and defeat. Air conditioning, still a luxury in much of Havana, kept the gaming rooms cool even on the hottest nights. There were no clocks on the walls and no windows to remind gamblers of the passing hours. The casino floor existed outside of normal time, a world unto itself where the only thing that mattered was the next roll of the dice, the next turn of the cards. The staff were trained to make customers feel special. Drinks were complimentary for anyone playing at the tables. Beautiful women in elegant gowns circulated through the rooms, adding to the atmosphere of sophistication and glamour. High rollers received personal attention from floor managers who remembered their names and preferences. The message was clear. Here you are someone important. Here your money and your presence are valued. As Lansky liked to say, we do not need to cheat. The odds are already in our favor. The mathematics of gambling guaranteed that the house would win in the long run. A fair game played long enough would inevitably favor the casino. All Lansky had to do was provide an honest game and a pleasant atmosphere, and the money would flow. This reputation for honesty attracted high rollers from across the Americas. Professional gamblers who had never set foot in a crooked joint felt comfortable placing large bets at Lansky's tables. Wealthy businessmen and celebrities knew they would get a fair game. The irony was not lost on anyone. The most honest casinos in the Western Hemisphere were run by the most notorious criminals in the United States, but the crown jewel of Lansky's empire was still being built. In 1956, he broke ground on a project that would consume his dreams and ultimately break his heart. The Hotel Riviera would be his masterpiece, a monument to everything he had worked to achieve. Rising 21 stories above the Malecón, the Riviera would be the largest purpose-built casino hotel in the world outside of Las Vegas. It was designed by the architect Irving Feldman in a modernist style that emphasized clean lines and dramatic curves. The building seemed to embrace the ocean, its balconies and windows oriented to capture the spectacular views of the Caribbean. At night, it would glow like a beacon, visible for miles along the waterfront. The construction cost $8 million, most of it provided by BANDS, the Cuban government development bank that Batista controlled. The hotel was officially operated by Riviera de Cuba S.A., a corporation whose shareholders included Miami Hotel Operators, a Canadian textile company, and various other entities that served to obscure the true ownership. But everyone knew it was Lansky's hotel, built with his vision and his connections, designed to be the ultimate expression of his Cuban dream. Lansky brought in the best designers money could buy. Albert Parvin, who had decorated the Flamingo in Las Vegas, designed the interiors. Parvin had started his career laying carpets in hotel rooms and had risen to become one of the most sought-after interior decorators in the gambling industry. He filled the Riviera with luxurious furnishings, from custom-made furniture to hand-woven carpets, creating an atmosphere of sophisticated elegance. Cuban artists were hired to add local flavor to the American design. The muralist Rolando Lopez de Rube created works that captured the spirit of the island. The sculptor Florencio Gelabert designed a magnificent white marble sculpture that fronted the main entrance, depicting a mermaid intertwined with a swordfish, a symbol of Cuba's maritime heritage. Another Gelabert piece, called Ritmo Cubano or Cuban Rhythm, stood in the lobby, a bronze sculpture of twirling dancers that seemed to capture the island's musical soul in frozen motion. When the Havana Riviera opened on December 10, 1957, it was an immediate sensation. Ginger Rogers performed on opening night, kicking off her heels and dancing across the stage of the Copa Room. Lansky reportedly complained that Rogers could wiggle her hips but she could not sing a note, but the audience loved her anyway. The hotel was packed with celebrities and socialites, curious tourists and serious gamblers, all eager to experience the newest and grandest addition to Havana's entertainment scene. Within days, the hotel became a symbol of the new Havana. Steve Allen taped an episode of his primetime television show from the pool deck, introducing American viewers to the glamour of Lansky's creation. Mamie Van Doren swam in the background while Allen cracked jokes about being in the home of Meyer Lansky. William Holden stayed in the penthouse. Nat King Cole performed in the showroom. Ava Gardner, according to hotel legend, seduced a bellhop and demanded that he be reassigned to her room for the duration of her stay. Lansky himself took up residence in the presidential suite on the top floor, installing himself as the hotel's unofficial master. From his windows, he could look out over the Caribbean and see the city he was helping to transform. At 65 years old, after a lifetime of operating in the shadows, he was finally legitimate, or as legitimate as a man like Meyer Lansky could ever be. He was no longer just a gangster hiding from the law. He was a hotel magnate, a pillar of the Cuban tourism industry, a personal friend of the president. When his health required attention, he checked into the best hospitals in Boston, flying there by private plane and receiving treatment under an assumed name. When his wife wanted to shop, they flew to New York for weekends at the finest stores. He was living the American dream, only 90 miles from American shores, in a country where his past seemed to matter less than his present success. In those glittering years of the mid-1950s, Havana became the most exciting city in the Western Hemisphere. The tourists came in waves, filling the hotels and the casinos and the nightclubs. They came from Miami and New York, from Chicago and Los Angeles, from as far away as Europe and South America. They came for the gambling and the beaches, for the rum and the music, for the intoxicating sense that in Havana the normal rules did not apply. At the center of this world was the Tropicana, the nightclub that called itself Paradise Under the Stars. If Meyer Lansky's casinos represented the cool efficiency of organized crime, the Tropicana was something else entirely. It was wild and sensual, a celebration of Cuban culture that left visitors breathless and converted skeptics into believers. The Tropicana had begun its life in 1939 as a modest nightclub on a suburban estate called Villa Mina, about a 20-minute drive from downtown Havana. The original owner, Victor de Coria, had seen the potential in the location, a 6-acre property covered with tropical gardens, and had established an outdoor cabaret where guests could dine and dance beneath the stars. But it was Martin Fox who would transform the Tropicana into something legendary. Fox was a Cuban businessman who had started out as a regular gambler at the club's casino. He lost money consistently, but he kept coming back, fascinated by the potential he saw in the venue. Eventually, he accumulated enough capital to buy out the previous owners, and in 1950 he took control of the Tropicana. Brig. Fox understood that the club's greatest asset was its setting, those 6 acres of tropical garden with their towering palm trees and flowering bushes. He hired the architect Max Borges Riccio, a brilliant young Cuban who had studied at Georgia Tech and Harvard, to design a new indoor venue that would complement the outdoor stages while protecting guests from the occasional tropical downpour. Borges created the Arcos de Cristal, the Crystal Arches, a structure so daring it won architecture prizes around the world. 5 thin concrete vaults soared overhead, each slightly smaller than the one before, creating a telescopic effect that drew the eye toward the orchestra pit. Glass walls dissolved the boundary between inside and outside, so that the dancers performing beneath the arches seemed to float among the trees. When the lights came on and the music started, the Arcos de Cristal became a dreamscape, a fantasy of modernist architecture serving the oldest human desire to celebrate and be amazed. The National Association of Cuban Architects awarded Borges their gold medal for the design in 1953, recognizing its masterful combination of architectural, structural, and landscape elements. Nothing like it existed anywhere else on Earth. The Tropicana had become not just a nightclub, but a work of art. But the Tropicana's real magic came from its shows. The choreographer Roderico Nera, known simply as Rodney, created productions that combined Afro-Cuban rhythms with elaborate staging and breathtaking acrobatics. Rodney had grown up in the rough neighborhoods of Havana, learning to dance in the streets before working his way up through the entertainment industry. He brought an authentic understanding of Cuban culture to his choreography, combined with a theatrical imagination that knew no limits. The dancers, many of them tall and beautiful mulatas in barely their costumes topped with enormous feathered headdresses, descended from catwalks suspended above the audience. They emerged from behind waterfalls and disappeared into clouds of theatrical smoke. They danced on bridges and platforms and moving stages, while drummers pounded out rhythms that seemed to come from the earth itself. A show at the Tropicana was not just entertainment. It was an assault on the senses, an overwhelming experience that left audiences stunned and exhilarated. The music at the Tropicana drew from Cuba's deep well of African-influenced traditions. The mambo, that irresistible rhythm invented by the bandleader Párez Prado, had swept through Latin America and the United States in the late 1940s. At the Tropicana, you could hear it played by the best musicians in the world. The orchestra's horn section could punch through the humid night air like a physical force, while the percussion section kept time with congas and bongos and timbales that spoke directly to something primal in the listener's soul. The rhythm of the mambo was different from anything Americans were used to hearing. In most popular music, the emphasis falls on the first beat of the measure. The one is the strongest, the foundation on which everything else is built. But in Cuban music, nothing happens on one. The emphasis shifts to the second and fourth beats, to the offbeats, creating a syncopation that makes the body move in new ways. American tourists who arrived in Havana confident in their dancing abilities discovered that everything they knew was wrong. The mambo required a different relationship between music and movement. a willingness to let go and follow the rhythm wherever it led. When the band played at the Tropicana, you did not just hear the music. You felt it in your chest, in your feet, in your hips that began to move whether you wanted them to or not. The professional dancers on stage made it look effortless, but the tourists who tried to keep up often found themselves humbled by the complexity of the rhythms and the skill of the performers. The celebrities who visited Havana in those years almost always ended up at the Tropicana. Marlon Brando was a regular, often seen playing his bongos alongside the house musicians, losing himself in the rhythms he had grown to love. Ernest Hemingway, who lived at his estate Finca Vigia outside the city, came frequently with guests and was given his own reserved table near the stage. Ava Gardner arrived fresh from her tumultuous honeymoon with Frank Sinatra at the Hotel Nacional and fell in love with the place. She returned again and again, sometimes alone, sometimes with new companions, always seeking the electric atmosphere that the Tropicana provided. Joan Crawford came, and Gary Cooper, and Nat King Cole. Josephine Baker performed there, as did Liberace, who reportedly mamboed on stage with the dancers. Jimmy Durante made audiences laugh, and Edith Piaf made them cry. The list of famous visitors went on and on. If you were famous in the 1950s and you came to Havana, you went to the Tropicana. The cabaret even staged a promotional stunt that became legendary in the history of Cuban tourism. They chartered a flight from Miami to Havana on Cubana de Aviación and transformed the airplane itself into a floating nightclub. The front seats were removed and replaced with a small stage where the Tropicana band somehow fit a pianist, a bongo player, a trumpet player, and a drummer. Dancers performed in the aisles all the way to Havana, giving passengers a taste of what awaited them when they landed. It was outrageous and impractical and entirely unforgettable, which was exactly the point. But there was a dark irony lurking beneath the glittering surface of the Tropicana and the other entertainment venues of 1950s Havana. Many of the performers who made these clubs famous were black, yet the island, like much of Cuban society, was segregated in ways both subtle and overt. Nat King Cole could perform to rapturous applause at the Tropicana, his velvet voice filling the night air and moving audiences to tears. But when the show ended and he wanted to retire for the evening, he could not check into the Hotel Nacional as a guest. The color of his skin determined which doors were open to him and which remained closed. Josephine Baker could dance at the Tropicana, her legendary performances drawing crowds from around the world. But the same society that celebrated her on stage reminded her constantly of her place in the racial hierarchy. This contradiction was woven into the fabric of Cuban society. The island's official mythology celebrated its racial harmony, the mixing of Spanish and African bloodlines that had created Cuban culture. Politicians and intellectuals spoke of Cuban identity as something that transcended race, a unique blend that made the island different from its neighbors. But in practice, discrimination was everywhere. The best beaches were reserved for whites. The most exclusive private clubs would not admit black members. Even President Batista, who was of mixed race, had been denied membership in some of Havana's most prestigious social clubs before he came to power. Afro-Cubans were concentrated in the poorest neighborhoods, crowded into substandard housing in areas like the Havana slum of Las Yaguas. They were relegated to the lowest-paying jobs, denied access to education and healthcare, systematically excluded from the wealth that the tourism boom was generating. The music that emerged from this complicated landscape was something extraordinary. It was the sound of a people finding joy and power in the midst of oppression, of African rhythms surviving the Middle Passage and the plantation and evolving into something new and vital. The religious traditions of Santeria, which blended African spiritual practices with Catholic saints, provided a foundation for musical forms that were both sacred and secular. The drums that drove the mambo and the rumba were descended from instruments used in religious ceremonies, carrying echoes of Africa across centuries and oceans. At the Tropicana and the other clubs of Havana, you could hear this music in its purest form, played by artists who were masters of their craft and who poured their souls into every performance. The musicians and dancers who created the shows were often the same people who played in the religious ceremonies of their communities, who gathered in solar parties in poor neighborhoods to celebrate and mourn and connect with their ancestors. Celia Cruz was one of these artists. Born in a poor neighborhood of Havana called Santo Suarez in 1925, she had risen through the ranks of Cuban music to become the lead singer of La Sonora Matanchera, the most famous band on the island. Her voice was a force of nature, powerful and expressive, capable of conveying joy and sorrow and everything in between. When she performed, audiences were transfixed by her energy, her charisma, and the unmistakable emotion she brought to every song. She would later become known as the Queen of Salsa, a global superstar who would carry Cuban music to the world after she fled the revolution and settled in the United States. Her trademark cry of azúcar, sugar, would become one of the most recognizable sounds in Latin music. But in the 1950s, she was just one of many brilliant artists who made Havana the center of a musical revolution. There were others whose names deserve to be remembered. Olga Guillard, whose emotional interpretations of boleros made audiences weep, was called the spirited queen of Cuban bolero. She shared stages with Frank Sinatra and Edith Piaf, her passionate style earning her admirers around the world. Benny Moré, the barbarian of rhythm, possessed a voice and showmanship that made him a legend throughout Latin America. Celeste Mendoza, the queen of Guaguancó, brought a powerful contralto voice to the traditional rumba form, her performances electric with energy and sensuality. These artists and dozens more created a musical golden age in Havana, a time when the city hummed with creativity and the whole world seemed to be listening. The mambo craze that swept through American popular culture had its roots in the stages and dance floors of Havana. At the Palladium Ballroom in New York, where bands led by Tito Puente and Machito and Tito Rodriguez played to packed houses, the rhythms were the same ones that had been perfected in Cuba. The dancers who packed the floor included people of all races, a rare integration in the segregated America of the 1950s, united by their love of music that transcended boundaries. The mob's investment in Cuban entertainment had an unexpected side effect. By building glamorous venues and attracting international attention, the gangsters inadvertently created platforms for Afro-Cuban culture to reach audiences who had never experienced it before. American tourists who came to Havana for the gambling discovered the music and brought their love of it back home. The record companies began signing Cuban artists. The radio stations began playing Cuban rhythms. A sound that had developed in the poor neighborhoods of Havana was conquering the world. Meyer Lansky probably never thought of himself as a patron of the arts. He was in Cuba to make money, not to promote cultural exchange. But history has a way of creating connections that no one planned, and the legacy of the Havana mob includes not just corruption and exploitation, but also the global spread of rhythms that continue to move people today. Of course, the tourists who came to Havana in those years were not just listening to music, they were indulging in pleasures that would have been difficult or illegal to find back home. The island's reputation for vice was well established and deliberately cultivated. American magazine advertisements portrayed Cuba as a place of sensual delights, and the reality lived up to the hype. Gambling was the main attraction, with casinos operating openly and legally throughout Havana. But the entertainment options extended far beyond the gaming tables. The city had an estimated 270 brothels by the end of the decade, staffed by thousands of women who had few other economic options available to them. Prostitution was technically legal in Cuba, regulated by a system of health inspections and licensing that gave it a veneer of respectability. The establishments ranged from luxurious mansions catering to wealthy visitors to dingy rooms in the back streets where sailors and tourists of more modest means could find company for an hour. Casa Marina was perhaps the most famous, an elegant brothel that attracted businessmen and celebrities who wanted their indulgences served with style. But there were venues at every price point, a vast industry built on the desperation of women with no other way to survive. For visitors who wanted something more exotic, there was the Shanghai Theatre in Chinatown, a notorious burlesque house that presented live sex shows on stage. Superman shows, they were called, featuring performers engaged in acts that would have landed everyone involved in jail anywhere in the United States. The theater was a notorious stop on the tourist circuit, drawing curious visitors who wanted to see just how far Havana's permissiveness actually extended. Drugs were easily available too. Marijuana, cocaine, and heroin all flowed through the island, some destined for American markets and some consumed by visitors looking to enhance their Cuban experience. The mob's involvement in narcotics trafficking was an open secret, and Cuba served as a convenient way station for shipments heading north. All of this was permitted, even encouraged, by a government that saw the vice industry as an economic resource to be exploited rather than a social problem to be addressed. Batista had made a calculation that the profits from tourism and from the payoffs he received from the mob were worth whatever damage the industry might do to Cuban society. He was not wrong about the profits. He was catastrophically wrong about the costs. The playwright Arthur Miller, visiting Havana in those years, described it as hopelessly corrupt, a mafia playground, a bordello for Americans and other foreigners. He captured something essential about the city in that era, the way it existed to serve the desires of outsiders while its own people struggled to survive. For the tourists, Havana was paradise. For many Cubans, it was something closer to purgatory. The corruption went deeper than just tolerance for gambling and prostitution. It extended into every corner of Cuban government and society. Batista had created a system of institutionalized bribery that enriched him and his cronies while impoverishing the nation. Every government contract came with kickbacks. Every business license required a payment to the right official. Every transaction, from the largest construction project to the smallest favor, generated income for someone connected to the regime. The parking meters that Batista had installed throughout Havana were not just an annoyance to drivers. They were a personal revenue stream for Roberto Fernandez y Miranda, the brother of Batista's wife, who collected a percentage of every coin deposited. The slot machines that appeared in hotels and restaurants, and even country fairs across Cuba, were controlled by the same family member. These petty corruptions became symbols of the regime's venality, constant reminders to ordinary Cubans that their country was being looted by those in power. Estimates of what Batista personally extracted from the Cuban economy vary, but the amounts were staggering. Ben Deer. Some historians believe he accumulated hundreds of millions of dollars during his years in power, money that flowed into Swiss bank accounts and real estate holdings around the world. Meyer Lansky reportedly contributed millions per year to these accounts, the price of doing business in a country where the president expected his share of every profitable enterprise. The visible symbols of this corruption enraged ordinary Cubans. They watched as glittering hotels rose along the Malecón, built with government funds, while their neighborhoods lacked basic services like clean water and reliable electricity. They saw American tourists spending in one night what they earned in a month, dropping chips on roulette tables while Cuban children went without adequate food. They understood that their country was being sold piece by piece to foreign gangsters, and that their own government was collecting commissions on every transaction. But the most bitter grievance was not the corruption itself. It was the violence that accompanied it. Batista maintained power through terror as well as bribery, and his secret police had earned a reputation for brutality that made even hardened criminals uncomfortable. The SIM, the Servicio de Inteligencia Militar, was responsible for maintaining internal security, which in practice meant identifying and eliminating anyone who threatened the regime. Dissidents were arrested without charges, held in secret locations, and subjected to interrogation techniques that amounted to torture. Some never returned. Their bodies appeared on roadsides and in ditches, bullet holes in the back of the head, a message to others who might be considering resistance. University students were particular targets. The University of Havana had a long tradition of political activism, and student organizations had been at the forefront of previous movements for reform and revolution. Batista responded to student protests with violence. Those who organized demonstrations were beaten and arrested. Those who persisted were sometimes killed. In 1957, a group of students attacked the presidential palace in a desperate attempt to assassinate Batista. The attack failed, and the survivors were hunted down and murdered. The contrast between the glittering facade and the ugly reality became impossible to ignore. In the tourist districts, life seemed wonderful. The bands played, the dancers danced, and the roulette wheels spun. But in the rest of Havana, and especially in the Cuban countryside, a revolution was beginning to take shape. The frustrations of decades were building toward an explosion, and when it came, it would sweep away everything the mob had built. It started with a young lawyer named Fidel Castro, a man whose ambition and charisma would reshape not just Cuba, but the entire Western Hemisphere. Castro came from a prosperous family that owned sugar plantations in eastern Cuba, but he had developed radical political views during his years at the University of Havana. He was tall and imposing, standing over 6 feet, with a beard that would become one of the most recognizable images of the 20th century. He was a compelling speaker who could hold an audience's attention for hours, his voice rising and falling as he denounced injustice and called for revolution. Castro had been involved in politics since his student days, when he joined organizations fighting for reform and against the corrupt governments of the 1940s. He was ambitious, impatient, and convinced that Cuba's problems could only be solved through radical change. When Batista seized power in 1952, Castro saw his opportunity. On July 26, 1953, Castro led an attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba, the second largest military installation in the country. It was a suicidal mission, poorly planned and badly executed, relying on surprise and audacity to overcome the massive disparity in numbers and firepower. Castro had hoped that a bold strike against the army would inspire a popular uprising that would bring down the Batista regime in a matter of days. Instead, his small band of rebels was massacred. They attacked at dawn, but nothing went according to plan. Some of the vehicles carrying the attackers got lost in the unfamiliar city streets. Others arrived at the wrong locations. The element of surprise was lost almost immediately, and the defenders of the barracks responded with overwhelming force. Of the roughly 160 rebels who participated in the attack, many were killed in the fighting or captured and executed in the aftermath. Those who were not killed were subjected to torture before being brought to trial. Castro himself was taken alive, a stroke of luck that would change the course of history. A lieutenant who captured him refused orders to execute the prisoner, insisting that Castro be brought to face justice through the legal system. It was a decision that Batista would regret. At his trial, Castro delivered a speech that would become one of the founding documents of the Cuban Revolution. Speaking for hours in his own defense, Castro catalogued the crimes of the Batista regime, the poverty and injustice that plagued Cuban society, and the historic responsibility of the Cuban people to rise up against tyranny. He quoted José Martí, the hero of Cuban independence, drawing a direct line from the struggles of the 19th century to the present moment. He spoke of the hungry children and the unemployed workers, of the farmers without land and the families without hope. His closing words became a rallying cry that echoed across the island. "Condemn me," he said. "It does not matter. History will absolve me." The phrase captured something essential about Castro's character, his unshakable confidence that he was on the right side of destiny, that his cause was so just that the verdict of history was already determined. Castro was sentenced to 15 years in prison on the Isle of Pines, a prison island off the coast of Cuba. He might have spent the next decade and a half there, forgotten by the world, watching the Batista regime consolidate its power. But events would not unfold that way. In 1955, Batista granted a general amnesty to political prisoners, including Castro and the other survivors of the Moncada attack. It was a gesture of confidence, or perhaps arrogance, by a dictator who believed his power was secure. Batista could not imagine that this young lawyer, this failed revolutionary, posed any real threat to his regime. He was wrong. Castro immediately went into exile in Mexico, where he began planning his return to Cuba. He gathered around him a small group of dedicated revolutionaries, including his brother Raúl and a young Argentine doctor named Ernesto Guevara, who would become known to the world as Che. Guevara was a romantic revolutionary, a man who had traveled through Latin America and seen the poverty and injustice that pervaded the continent. He had become convinced that only armed revolution could bring about meaningful change, and he threw himself into Castro's movement with passionate dedication. They trained in the Mexican countryside, learning guerrilla tactics and preparing for the day when they would bring the fight back to Cuban soil. The training was hard, the conditions primitive, and the odds against them overwhelming. They had no air support, no heavy weapons, no realistic hope of matching the Cuban army in conventional combat. Everything depended on the willingness of the Cuban people to rise up against their oppressors. That day came on November 25, 1956, when 82 rebels crowded onto a small yacht called the Glamour and set sail for Cuba. The boat had been designed to carry about a dozen people comfortably. With more than 80 men packed into its 43 feet of length, it was dangerously overloaded. The voyage became a nightmare almost immediately. Storms battered the vessel, sending waves crashing over the deck and leaving most of the revolutionaries sick and demoralized. The engine failed repeatedly. Navigation was nearly impossible in the rough seas. They were supposed to arrive on the coast of Oriente Province on November 30th, timed to coincide with an uprising in the city of Santiago that would draw attention away from their landing. Instead, they arrived 2 days late, at the wrong location, their arrival a surprise to no one except themselves. The Cuban army was waiting. Within hours of landing, the rebels were attacked by government forces. The column was scattered, men fleeing into the swamps and forests with nothing but their rifles and what little ammunition they could carry. Of the 82 who had set sail from Mexico, only about a dozen survived to reach the safety of the Sierra Maestra Mountains. This seemingly catastrophic beginning was actually the start of one of the most remarkable guerrilla campaigns in history. From their mountain stronghold, Castro and his bearded rebels, the Barbudos, began a war of attrition against the Cuban army. They had almost nothing, a handful of weapons, a few hundred rounds of ammunition, the clothes on their backs, and an unshakable conviction that they would prevail. They ambushed military patrols, capturing weapons and supplies from the enemy. They established contacts with sympathizers in the towns and villages at the base of the mountains. They recruited local peasants, men who knew the terrain and had their own grievances against the Batista regime. Slowly, painfully, they built an army. More importantly, they won the support of the local population. The rebels distributed land to peasants, established schools and clinics in areas they controlled, and treated the civilian population with respect that contrasted sharply with the brutality of the government forces. When Batista's soldiers burned villages suspected of supporting the revolution, it only drove more people into Castro's arms. Radio Rebelde, the rebel radio station, broadcast Castro's message across the island. Cubans who had never seen the Sierra Maestra could hear the voice of the revolution, telling them that a different future was possible. Journalists from American newspapers and magazines made the dangerous journey into the mountains and returned with stories of these romantic revolutionaries who were fighting against impossible odds. Herbert Matthews of the New York Times conducted a famous interview with Castro that made him an international figure, a symbol of resistance to tyranny. In Havana, life continued much as before. The casinos stayed open, the tourists kept coming, and the money continued to flow. The mob bosses who controlled the gambling industry were aware of the rebellion in the mountains, but they did not take it seriously. They had survived political instability before, and they assumed they could survive it again. Their relationship was with the Cuban government, regardless of who happened to be running it at the moment. They had even hedged their bets by providing some financial support to Castro's movement, a contribution made through intermediaries that was intended to buy goodwill no matter which side won. It was the kind of practical calculation that had served them well throughout their careers. This was a profound miscalculation. The gangsters understood politics as a business, a matter of deals and payments and mutual self-interest. They did not understand ideology, the power of ideas to transform societies and sweep away arrangements that seemed permanent. Castro was not just another politician looking for his share of the spoils. He was a revolutionary who intended to remake Cuban society from the ground up. When his rebels finally entered Havana, the mob would discover that they had been dealing with something entirely outside their experience. The end came faster than anyone expected. Throughout 1958, the tide of the war turned decisively in Castro's favor. The Cuban army, demoralized and poorly led, suffered defeat after defeat. Batista's support crumbled as the middle class and even some of the wealthy began to see the revolution as Cuba's only hope for change. In December, the rebels won a crucial victory at the city of Santa Clara, where Che Guevara led a column that captured an armored train carrying reinforcements and supplies to Batista's forces. The victory demonstrated that the rebels could fight and win in open terrain, not just in the mountains where they had the advantage of familiar ground. It became clear that the government could not hold out much longer. On the night of December 31st, 1958, Fulgencio Batista hosted a New Year's Eve party at his presidential palace. His cabinet members and military commanders gathered to celebrate the arrival of 1959, though the mood was far from festive. Everyone knew that the end was near. The rebel armies were closing in from multiple directions. The Cuban army had lost the will to fight. International support for the regime had evaporated. Sometime after midnight, Batista raised a glass, wished his guests farewell, and informed them that he was leaving the country. Within hours, he was on a plane to the Dominican Republic, accompanied by his family, his closest associates, and as much money as they could carry. He left behind chaos, confusion, and a power vacuum that the revolutionaries would fill. The news spread through Havana like wildfire. Batista had fled. The government had collapsed. The rebels were coming. For the gangsters who had built their fortunes on Cuban gambling, the situation was desperate. Meyer Lansky was at a party at the Plaza Hotel when an associate whispered the news in his ear. According to witnesses, the color drained from his face. He had invested everything in Cuba, his money, his dreams, his vision of a criminal empire beyond the reach of American law. And now it was all about to be swept away. "Get the money," he ordered. His men scrambled to empty the counting rooms of every casino, gathering millions of dollars in cash before the revolutionaries could seize it. They worked through the night, stuffing bills into suitcases and finding ways to get them off the island. Some of the money made it out, much of it did not. When Castro's supporters flooded into the streets that New Year's morning, their first targets were the symbols of corruption they had learned to hate. Mobs attacked the casinos, smashing slot machines and setting them ablaze. Roulette wheels were dragged into the streets. Gaming tables were overturned and destroyed. The parking meters that had enriched Batista's relatives were torn from the ground and demolished. At the Riviera, Lansky's beloved masterpiece, someone released a truckload of pigs into the lobby. The animals squealed and ran through the marble halls, tracking mud across the floors, defecating in the spaces that had been designed to impress the wealthy and powerful. It was a deliberate humiliation, a message that the era of foreign exploitation was over. The most elegant hotel in the Caribbean had been transformed into a pigsty, and the symbolism was lost on no one. The casinos were closed immediately by the new revolutionary government. Then, after a few weeks, they were briefly reopened when Castro realized how many Cubans depended on tourism jobs. Thousands of dealers, waiters, cooks, and entertainers had no other way to earn a living. Shuttering the casinos meant putting them all out of work, but the reopening was temporary. The mobsters who returned to Cuba hoping to resume business discovered that the rules had changed completely. Castro announced that there would be monitors in the counting rooms, government officials who would watch every transaction and ensure that taxes were paid on every dollar. The jig was up, as one gangster put it. "Rebels in the counting rooms. You cannot have rebels in the counting rooms. That is where the money is stolen." Without the ability to skim, the casinos were worthless to the mob. They negotiated, bargained, and pleaded, but it was futile. The new rulers were not interested in deals. They were building a different kind of society, one that had no room for American gangsters and their Cuban partners. In October 1960, Castro nationalized all the hotels and casinos, seizing them without compensation. Gambling was permanently banned. The tourists stopped coming. The American cars that rolled through the streets began their long, slow transformation into the vintage relics we see in photographs today, maintained and repaired for decades because new parts and new vehicles were impossible to obtain. Santo Traficante Jr. lingered in Havana longer than most of his colleagues, hoping that something could be salvaged from the wreckage. He was eventually arrested by the revolutionary government and held for months at a detention camp. before being deported back to the United States. He never recovered his Cuban investments. Lansky chartered a plane to the Bahamas, fleeing the country he had worked so hard to transform. He would spend the rest of his life trying to recreate what he had lost in Cuba, exploring possibilities in the Bahamas, in Haiti, in any jurisdiction that might welcome his particular expertise. But he never found another paradise. The Hotel Riviera still stands today, a faded monument to dreams that died before they could be fully realized. The building that Lansky designed to be the ultimate expression of his vision now operates as a state-run hotel, its rooms worn and its facilities dated. Staff members still refer to it as the Hotel of Meyer Lansky, and photographs of the gangster and his celebrity guests adorn the walls. The marble sculptures remain, the mermaid and swordfish still greeting visitors at the entrance, the bronze dancers still frozen in their eternal rhythm in the lobby. Lansky never recovered financially or emotionally from the loss of Cuba. He spent his remaining years fighting legal battles, as the American government tried repeatedly to deport him for his criminal activities. He attempted to emigrate to Israel, claiming the right of return under the law of return, but was rejected. He looked for refuge in Paraguay and other countries, but found no welcome. When he died in 1983, his estate was valued at less than $60,000. The man who had once controlled an empire worth hundreds of millions had ended his life in modest circumstances, a fraction of what he had lost when Castro's rebels released those pigs into his hotel lobby. His grandson still speaks of trying to recover compensation for the Riviera from the Cuban government, a claim that has never been resolved and probably never will be. The legacy of the Havana mob is complicated, a mixture of exploitation and achievement, corruption and culture. The gangsters who ruled Cuba in the 1950s were criminals who profited from human weakness and political corruption. They enabled a brutal dictator and extracted wealth from an impoverished nation. They built an industry on gambling and prostitution, on the desperation of the poor and the desires of the rich. The suffering they caused, directly and indirectly, should not be forgotten or romanticized. But they also built something remarkable, even if they built it for the wrong reasons. The hotels and nightclubs of 1950s Havana were architectural and cultural achievements that continue to fascinate us decades later. The Arcos de Cristal at the Tropicana, the modernist towers along the Malecon, the elegant interiors of the great casino hotels, these were genuine accomplishments designed by talented architects and artists who created beauty even in the service of corruption. The music that flourished in the clubs they patronized became a global phenomenon that still brings joy to millions. The Cuban musicians and dancers and artists who performed in mob-owned venues went on to create works that transcended their origins. Celia Cruz carried Cuban rhythms to audiences around the world, her voice becoming one of the defining sounds of Latin music for the rest of the 20th century. The mambo and the rumba and their descendants continue to move people on dance floors from New York to Tokyo. The revolution transformed Cuba in ways that no one could have predicted. Castro initially presented himself as a democratic reformer, promising free elections and a return to constitutional government. But within months, it became clear that he had something very different in mind. The casinos were just the beginning. Over the next 2 years, the revolutionary government nationalized virtually all private property on the island, from the sugar plantations to the utilities to the small businesses that lined the streets of Havana. The wealthy fled first, taking what they could carry and leaving behind lives they had built over generations. Professionals followed, doctors and lawyers and engineers who saw no future for themselves in a socialist state. Eventually, even middle-class families began to leave, crowding onto boats and planes heading for Miami, just 90 miles away. The Cuban community in South Florida, which had numbered only a few thousand before 1959, grew to hundreds of thousands, and then millions, becoming a political and cultural force that would shape American politics for decades. Those who remained in Cuba experienced a transformation that was sometimes brutal and sometimes exhilarating. The new government launched ambitious literacy campaigns that brought education to the countryside for the first time. Hotel became universal and free, The gross inequalities that had characterized Cuban society began to diminish as wealth was redistributed and basic services were extended to the poor, but there was a cost. Political freedom disappeared. The revolutionary government did not tolerate dissent, and those who opposed Castro found themselves in prison or facing exile. The Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, neighborhood organizations established to support the government, also served as surveillance networks, tracking the activities of ordinary citizens and reporting suspicious behavior. Cuba became a one-party state, its economy centrally planned, its culture increasingly isolated from the West. The mob's attempt to operate in Cuba had ended, but the enmity between the gangsters and Castro would continue for years. Santo Traficante Jr., nursing his grudge over the loss of his Cuban empire, allegedly became involved in CIA plots to assassinate the Cuban leader. The agency, desperate to eliminate Castro and reverse the revolution, reached out to organized crime figures who had their own reasons for wanting the Cuban president dead. Whether these plots were serious or merely fantasies remains debated by historians, but they represent another strange chapter in the tangled history of American organized crime and Cuban politics. The Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961 represented the climax of American efforts to overthrow Castro by force. A brigade of Cuban exiles, trained and equipped by the CIA, landed on the southern coast of Cuba expecting to spark a popular uprising against the revolution. Instead, they were crushed by Castro's forces within 3 days. The defeat was a humiliation for the United States and a triumph for Castro, who used it to solidify his power and justify his alliance with the Soviet Union. That alliance would bring the world to the brink of nuclear war just 18 months later, during the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. Soviet nuclear weapons deployed on Cuban soil aimed at American cities created a confrontation that could have ended civilization. For 13 days, the fate of humanity hung in the balance as Kennedy and Khrushchev negotiated through back channels and public threats. The crisis ended peacefully, with the Soviets withdrawing their missiles in exchange for American promises not to invade Cuba, but the experience left scars that have never fully healed. The Cuba that exists today is shaped by all of these events, by the decadence of the 1950s and the revolution that ended it, by the Cold War and the embargo that followed. The relationship between the United States and Cuba remains complicated, marked by decades of hostility that are only slowly beginning to thaw. American tourists are returning to Havana for the first time in generations, discovering a city that is both familiar and strange, frozen in some ways and transformed in others. And Las Vegas, the city that would eventually eclipse Havana as America's gambling capital, owes much of its character to the lessons learned in Cuba. When the casinos closed in Havana, hundreds of trained casino workers fled to Nevada. Dealers, pit bosses, hotel managers, and entertainers brought their expertise and their connections to the desert, helping to build the gaming industry we know today. The same mobsters who had operated in Cuba pivoted to Vegas, investing the money they had saved and applying the methods they had perfected. If you walk the streets of Havana today, you can still feel the ghosts of that vanished era. The Hotel Nacional stands on its bluff overlooking the sea, its lobby decorated with photographs of the gangsters and celebrities who once held court there. The Tropicana continues to operate, offering nightly cabaret shows that echo the productions of its golden age, the dancers still descending from catwalks, the drums still pounding out rhythms that have not changed in 70 years. The vintage American cars that Castro's revolution inadvertently preserved have become symbols of a city frozen in time. The Chevrolets and Buicks and Cadillacs from the 1950s roll through the streets, maintained and repaired by mechanics who have become experts in keeping these machines alive. They are reminders of the decades when Cuba and the United States were intimately connected, before revolution and embargo severed the ties. The Malecon stretches along the waterfront just as it did in the 1950s, lovers still walking hand in hand as the sun sets over the Caribbean. The salt air still carries the scent of tobacco from the nearby factories. If you stand there at twilight and let your imagination wander, you can almost hear the distant sound of a mambo band, the clink of chips on a roulette table. the laughter of tourists discovering a world that seemed too good to be true. Because that is what Havana was in those years, a place that seemed like a dream but was built on nightmares, a city where the music was intoxicating and the poverty was crushing, where American gangsters mingled with Cuban artists, where dictators collaborated with democracies, where revolution simmered beneath a surface of champagne and cigars. It all ended, as such things must end, in fire and chaos and transformation. The paradise the mob built lasted barely a decade before history swept it away. The gangsters who had seemed so powerful were exposed as small men whose dreams exceeded their grasp. The dictator who had made everything possible fled in the night with his stolen millions. The tourists who had danced and gambled without a care discovered that the world they had enjoyed was never as solid as it seemed. But the stories remain. The music remains. And somewhere in the humid air of a Havana night, if you listen carefully, you can still hear the echoes of an era that will never come again. And so, as your eyes grow heavy and the sounds of the present fade away, let yourself drift into that lost world for a moment. Imagine the warm breeze off the Caribbean, the scent of tobacco and rum, the rhythm of drums calling you to dance. Imagine a city glittering with possibility and darkened by secrets, a place where the future hung in the balance and anything seemed possible. That was Havana in the 1950s. That was the paradise they built and lost. And now, dear friends, as the night grows quiet and sleep beckons, let these stories settle into your dreams, carrying you gently through the hours until morning comes again. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. If you enjoyed this journey through history, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss our next adventure into the past. Leave a comment letting me know what topic you would like to explore together, and I will see you very soon. Until then, sleep well, dream deeply, and remember that the past is never truly gone. It lives on in the stories we tell and the memories we keep. Good night, dear friends. Good night.